The content in this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only. Whilst we love unpacking psychological research and evidence-based insights to support well-being, this podcast is not a substitute for personal mental health care or therapy. Nothing we say should be taken as individualised advice. If anything you hear brings up concerns for you, we strongly encourage you to speak with your GP, psychologist, or another qualified health professional. You deserve support that's tailored to you.
We would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners of the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation on which this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their rich history and honour the ongoing connection to land, waters, culture, and community. Welcome to This Might Help, a podcast bridging the gap between evidence-based psychology research and your everyday life.
We're your hosts, Dr. Kira Hart
And Dr. Lauren Rossetti.
Two Australian psychologists with a passion for making psychological science practical and accessible.
If you haven't already had a listen, we released a pilot episode just very recently where we introduce you to the podcast and to ourselves. As a quick recap, I'm Lauren. I have a PhD in clinical neuropsychology, and I'm currently working across roles as both a psychologist and as a researcher.
And I'm Kira. I have a PhD in educational and developmental psychology. I work doing counselling and also as a teaching assistant at a university.
So today we will be kicking off our first ever episode with a discussion of social media and unpacking some of the research on both the positives and the negative impacts it can have on our mental health. And this is really relevant to a reason why we've started the podcast, because there is so much information out there on social media, particularly information about wellness and psychology, and it's really hard to know what is quality evidence-based information and what sources are trustworthy. So as psychologists and researchers, we wanted to get this podcast started to help unpack some of that really quality research evidence and unpack it for our audience.
Exactly. When you say quality evidence-based research, Lauren, what exactly are you referring to?
So I am talking about the types of evidence that we'll be using across the podcast, which is high quality peer-reviewed journal articles mostly, and then also sprinkled in with some other credible sources like government agencies, the World Health Organization, Headspace, other organizations like that.
Amazing. Before we dive into the research today, we're going to begin each episode with a wellbeing win of the week. So Lauren, what was the wellbeing win of your week?
My wellbeing win, which all of my family and friends are so sick of me talking about by this point, is my post-work exercise. Okay. So I have shifted my exercise class to be after my workday finishes. So straight after work, I jump off to my Pilates class, and I'm finding this is de-stressing me, unpacking kind of all of that tension from the day and really helping me settle into the night. And I used to be trying to make myself into a morning person and working out before I started the workday, but I am loving my switch to post-work exercise.
So good.
How about you, Kira? What's your wellbeing win?
My wellbeing win, it's a pretty wholesome one for our first ever episode. I just had a really lovely dinner at my mum and dad's house the other night. They live quite close to my work, so I finished work, went over to theirs for a beautiful dinner and a really nice catch up. So shout out to my mum and dad who promised they would be some of our first listeners. Thank you for the wonderful dinner the other evening.
I love that. Shout out to mum and dad. So we are starting off our first episode, like we said, talking about social media. We're going to unpack those positive and negative impacts on mental health and then talk about what we can do to find a balance on social media. And this was really relevant for us and the place we wanted to both start with our first episode because we are hoping to build a community through this podcast. And the way to do that is by putting the information out there on social media and having an Instagram and a TikTok for our podcast. And so we have had to think about managing our own relationship with social media and balancing those positive community building aspects with some of those negatives. So that's what we'll be unpacking today. Kira, can you please tell us, to get us started, a bit about the social media landscape at the moment? What does it look like?
So if we look at a global level, Facebook, according to Statista data as of 2025, is the most popular social media platform. Have a guess about how many monthly active users are on Facebook. So any number between like 1 and 8 billion, go.
Like 2 billion?
You're not far off, maybe just like a billion off. So
that's quite far
off. Just a few. So according to research, there is approximately 3.0 billion monthly active users on Facebook. Instagram has roughly 2 billion. But if we look at time spent on the apps, in Australia, TikTok is actually the most popular app or the most used app. So according to data from 2024, TikTok users were on the app for an average of 42 hours and 13 minutes a month. So quick maths, what's that? Just less than like 1 hour and a half a day. Does that surprise you, TikTok being the most used app?
I think that's pretty consistent with what I hear and see from friends and others, that TikTok is the most popular and definitely the most popular recently, although I think Instagram Reels is probably going to give it a run for its money soon. And that TikTok algorithm that leverages that continuous content delivery and the personalized, that personalized content really, I think, maximizes time that people spend on TikTok.
100%. So we know social media use is increasing each year. So for this first episode, we really wanted to focus on how we can better understand and leverage the positive impacts that social media can have on mental health, whilst also mitigating the potential negative impacts it can have on mental health as well. It's also important to acknowledge that every person's experience on social media is different. However, across the research, they've identified some key positive impacts and negative impacts, which we'll talk about today. So let's begin with the positive impacts.
So across studies, researchers speak about how social media can enhance our mental health by facilitating those meaningful social connections and reducing isolation. So the positive impacts they raise are really around social connection, reduced isolation, and this has been useful particularly for those marginalized groups as well. So people that may find it difficult to build those social connections and communities out in the real world, or it's hard to find their kind of group of people that they really connect with. And that's where social media can be particularly beneficial. And then also we see that help-seeking behavior can be promoted through social media. So access or exposure to resources or other services that can pop up.
Definitely. Also on the topic of social connection, I'm just thinking personally, and this is probably a pretty obvious one, but as time goes on and friends move overseas, social media is such a great way to stay connected and to stay up to date with each other, despite those geographical distances.
And I think when we talk about these positive impacts of social media on mental health, so those reduced feelings of isolation and increased connection, we're often thinking about this active participation on social media.
Okay, active
participation. Yeah. So active participation is when we are jumping on social media with a purpose. So you might be engaging in these meaningful interactions with friends and family. That could be messaging someone. It could be sharing content. It could be jumping on there with a purpose of viewing something in particular or communicating with someone. These active kind of positive engagement patterns are different to what we would call passive consumption or engagement on social media. And that passive consumption is more of the alignment with the term doom scrolling. So when we are just scrolling, like the term says, passively, we're not kind of actively engaging, we're just
consuming content.
Yeah, we're just letting the content wash over our eyes, essentially. Yeah. And that is more associated with some of those negative impacts versus the research on the positive impacts being associated with that active engagement.
Okay, so we know that social media, the active use of social media can reduce loneliness and facilitate connections.
Yeah.
And you've spoken to how that more passive use of social media has some negative consequences on mental health. What are some of those negative consequences?
So the increased use of social media, so more time on social media, and that passive use, like we just talked about, has been associated with increased symptoms of depression, anxiety, and can also be associated with loneliness. So we can see that that increased use and passive use particularly can have some negative mental health effects.
Definitely.
And there is potentially a bidirectional effect. So what that means is that if you are using social media more frequently, there's that higher use that can be associated with more symptoms of depression and anxiety. But also in the reverse, if you're already prone to experiencing more symptoms of depression and anxiety, you then may be more likely to have a higher social media use time or that more passive negative use of social media as well. So it can go both ways.
Yeah.
The World Health Organization has also reported a rise in social media use, which is not surprising given what we talked about before with the number of hours on TikTok as well and how many active users there are a month. We know even qualitatively that it's something that's really increasing, but they have particularly spoken about a rise in problematic social media use.
Okay, what do you mean by problematic social media use?
So like the name suggests, it's a problem.
Okay, not a good thing. Yeah.
But this problematic social media use is defined as, I guess, a pattern of behavior which has these addiction-like symptoms. So this is when you're using social media in a way that you have trouble controlling. So you might experience an inability to kind of get off the social media platforms. You might experience withdrawal when you're not using it. You might neglect other activities in the place of using social media. So you might not be, going out for that exercise class or to catch up with someone because you're spending time on social media.
Yeah.
And then you face negative consequences in your daily life as a result. So that problematic social media use is really talking about the kind of addictive-like nature of your engagement with social media.
Yeah.
And then this problematic social media use is what we see in the research to be associated with those more negative mental health effects, whereas the positive purposeful use, so that active use that we talked about before, is more associated with the benefits we spoke about, so the increased social connection and enjoyment. There is lots there in terms of the research behind why increased and problematic or passive social media use can have a negative impact on our mental health. But why is that the case? Why is it that when we spend more time on social media and we spend more passive, problematic time, that it has this negative impact on our mental health?
There is so many reasons why problematic or passive social media use can negatively impact our mental health. One of those reasons is social comparison. So social comparisons on social media has been widely linked with negative mental health outcomes. Research has found that when we compare ourselves to others online, particularly those upwards comparisons, or when we look to someone we idolize, it can lead to users comparing themselves unfavorably, which results in negative self-evaluation, lower self-esteem, and increased depressive symptoms. Another reason is just the overwhelm and overload of information that we're exposed to on social media. When we go on social media, we have access to unprecedented amounts of content on social media apps. And this content ranges from positive content like maybe a cute photo of a puppy or neutral content to quite upsetting or distressing content.
Yeah.
When we think of exposure to negative content, the first thing that might come to mind is exposure to violence or crime or a tragic disaster and really graphic, disturbing imagery. However, negative content can be a lot more subtle and invasive than that. Even negative comments on someone's posts or a seemingly innocent photo depicting like a social catch-up that may trigger feelings of loneliness or exclusion for someone can also be considered negative content. And the research has shown that exposure to negative content can trigger acute stress responses. It can heighten anxiety. And in those extreme cases, it can cause secondary trauma.
Okay.
If we really consider it, our minds weren't designed to process the constant influx of negative information we have access to on social media. And so it makes so much sense why people may experience anxiety or emotional overwhelm when they check their phone and they're constantly viewing this negative content about events that are outside of their control.
And I think also sometimes we're not mentally prepared to come across that negative content. So our brains aren't primed to be coming across something that is really negative or graphic, and you're on there just scrolling to see, the posts from your family or friends, and then you come across something that your brain isn't prepared to see and you haven't had time to adjust and kind of get yourself ready to view that content, versus I guess going on social media to see updates about world events or things happening, and you're kind of seeking out or prepared to see that information. And I think even like you mentioned, it can really be subtle. So I notice as well, like you mentioned with the negative comment sections, sometimes if I was on TikTok or Instagram Reels and I've clicked on the comments and I'm reading through this whole flow of really negative or harsh critiques of someone that was posting something probably quite harmless, and then you're just consuming that. And I think at the time it maybe doesn't feel like it's having a negative impact, or you're reading through that and you're almost kind of consuming the drama, or you're kind of being entertained by it. But I think that constant consumption of negativity or critique as well, that can have an impact on our own mindset too.
Yeah, definitely. Social media can also have a negative impact on mental health due to the degree to which it disrupts other activities that are essential for health and well-being. So we know that the social media apps are designed to keep us hooked. Every time we log on and we get a notification, our brain gets that hit of dopamine, which makes us feel excited. And therefore we associate phone use with feelings of pleasure. So we're more and more likely to interact with our phone and use the social media platforms, which then eats into the time that we otherwise would spend maybe catching up with friends or calling a friend or doing exercise.
So we know that social media can have negative impacts on our mental health, including these increased symptoms of depression and anxiety. That's particularly for this passive problematic use. And that can be the result of things like this upward social comparison, the types of negative content that we see, and that we're spending less time potentially doing things that are really good for our mental health, like, activities and exercise and seeing friends.
Wholesome things, yeah.
Yes. But we also know that there are these benefits from social media that we enjoy, like connecting with others and reducing feelings of loneliness, and that's kind of related to that active use that we have on social media. But how do we then bring back a balance? So for lots of us, we want to potentially reduce our time on social media. We're lost in that doom scrolling kind of sense, and it's not really a nice feeling, but we want to find a balance. So experience the good things and decrease those negative impacts.
Yeah.
There is not a lot of research in this area, so it's still developing. But there are some interventions that have been trialed to decrease the negative impacts of social media on our mental health. Now, there are some researchers out of the University College London in the UK who have reviewed the available studies on social media intervention. So they've kind of pulled all this data together and have had a look at what the landscape of this research kind of looks like overall. So there were 3 main intervention types that have been used in the past, and those include full abstinence from social media. So that's just completely cutting it out.
Yeah, cold turkey.
Cold turkey. Then there are reduced time interventions. So these focus on just getting the time lower on social media, but not necessarily around how or why that's done. And then another type of intervention that was used are these therapy-based interventions. And these can have a combination of reducing the time on social media and also with a therapy-based element. And so that can look like the combination of something like mindfulness or a reflection of how social media affects our thoughts, emotions, and behavior. So that intervention is pairing or just using the therapy-based elements on their own. But I guess it's really focusing on understanding those thoughts, emotions, and behaviors around our social media use. So not just time on its own. Now, they found that interventions which simply restrict social media use or impose that full cold turkey abstinence of social media may not have as much benefit for our mental well-being as those therapy-based interventions. So they were generally not as effective or not as sustainable. So then the therapy-based interventions were the ones that had the greatest effect, and they may also help people to reflect on what they are prioritizing. So because they're kind of increasing this awareness of social media use, they may also help people to replace some of that problematic social media time with other activities that they want to prioritize.
Interesting. That really aligns with some really recent research that we came across whilst we were preparing for this episode. I must admit, I fangirled hard when I came across the research by Amira Skeggs and Dr. Amy Auburn from the Digital Mental Health Group out of the University of Cambridge. Their research looks at social media interventions on improving well-being, and they recently published a paper in May this year. So only
fresh off the press.
Exactly. You heard it here first. But their paper identified 2 primary approaches that social media interventions can take. The first being quantitative use reduction approaches, which are currently the most common approach. These interventions focus on reducing the amount of time users spend on social media. So like the study you just spoke about, interventions that focused just on reducing time showed mixed or limited effects for improving mental health. Just reducing time spent on social media doesn't address the fact that we also want to increase the positive active use and decrease the problematic passive use. It just focuses on the time, the minutes, the hours spent on the apps.
Yeah.
So instead, there's also a qualitative use improvement approach proposed. This is presented as an emerging and potentially more promising alternative. Instead of focusing just on reducing time, this approach aims to change the content users engage with or the nature of their social media interactions. The goal is to steer users away from potentially harmful interactions, so those excessive social comparisons or exposure to harmful content, and more towards those beneficial uses of social media, such as the positive connections or engaging in educational content.
Yeah.
This approach may be more successful in the long term because it acknowledges that social media is a large part of people's lives and focuses on our relationship with social media rather than just trying to go cold turkey or reduce the time we spend on social media altogether.
Yeah. Okay. So simply trying to use it less or limit time is likely not going to lead to sustainable, meaningful change in how we engage with social media. I think that's what this research and the early research in this intervention space is showing us. That strategies really need to focus on increasing awareness of how and why we engage with social media and then becoming more mindful of our social media habits.
Okay, so we've spoken a lot about the research today, and it sounds like these qualitative use improvement approaches might be a more promising way to find the balance on social media. Before we wrap up, what are some specific strategies that I or the listeners could employ to help find the balance between the positive and negative aspects of social media?
So we have a few little things.
Yes, something we prepared earlier.
So these strategies are based on the research we've just discussed. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, everyone's relationship with social media is different.
Yeah.
Everyone's engagement is going to be different as well. And I think for those who are really having a hard time or finding that problematic, addictive like nature really hard to shift, engaging with a professional, a psychologist, or someone else could be really helpful for them. Okay. Some of these strategies that we're going to have a chat about are, like I mentioned, based on the research and also some great resources that we've seen on services like Headspace. So they have some really great articles about this that we will link in the show notes. So to get us started, I think one of the places to begin is looking at screen time.
Okay.
As confronting as that can be, sometimes I hate it, but I find it very helpful. So I think that we need to get an idea of where we are at with our social media use. Yeah. And that comes from getting an idea of what apps you're using the most, what you're clicking on the most, what you're spending the most time on, and how much time does that look like? Is there a particular time of day that's really tricky, like the morning or nighttime? Is it just on the weekends? Is it on the weekdays? Like, essentially, what does your social media use look like? And then having a think about whether that's active or passive. So are you really using a lot of that time for that active social media use? You know, maybe it's for your job, or maybe you're jumping on there to chat with a friend or post something. And then, you know, do you need to limit that? Maybe you're just experiencing some really nice, lovely mental health benefits from that. Or is there a lot of passive use and you're really feeling those negative mental health effects? Having a think.
Yeah. Are you doom scrolling?
Are you doom scrolling all the time?
Yeah. All day, every day.
Yeah. Let's get an idea. And then there are some phone-based things we can do. So we can set limits on individual apps in things like an iPhone, and I think you can do it on all of the other phones as well, probably, not that I know.
Yeah.
So setting limits on individual apps. Now, I know that lots of people do this, myself included, and it does not stop me from going into the app. However, I'm still suggesting them for a reason. Yeah. I will go through. So when you set a limit on the app, for example, I might have a 1 hour limit on Instagram a day. When I am reaching that limit, your iPhone sends you a little notification like you've got 10 minutes remaining or 5 minutes remaining. And then when you reach the 1 hour limit, it will pop up on your screen and say you've reached your limit, like get out of the app, essentially. It's very easy to click ignore.
Yeah.
You can ignore for a few minutes. You could ignore for the whole day. I often ignore for the whole day if I'm being very honest. But what that does is makes you aware of how much time you have then spent on that app. So then I know, oh, I have spent an hour on this day on that app. And again, like we talked about with the research, we're building that conscious awareness.
Yeah.
So having that there is just a prompt to understand how much time you're using, and maybe for some of our listeners that will actually click off the app and it will limit their time. Yeah. Who knows? They may be a rare unicorn that works for them. But for the rest of us, it maybe just makes us aware of how much time we are spending on the app.
Yeah.
which is building that conscious awareness. That's what we want to do. Then another thing is physically moving the apps on your phone. And like we talked about with problematic social media use, when you are in that kind of addictive like stage with social media where it's really unconscious and you don't have a lot of control over it, you will notice that you open your phone, you automatically scroll, click and find the app and you don't even know how you got there.
Yes, the muscle memory to Instagram is a real thing.
Yeah, and it's scary sometimes. How did I get here? I didn't even intend to be in Instagram. I've just been doing something at work that was kind of stressful, or I don't know, people are doing something challenging, and then your body is automatically like, I want this dopamine rush. I want to feel like, you know, a bit better. And so I'm going to pick this up, and your body's automatically taking you to Instagram.
Yeah.
Now, if you relocate the location of those apps on your phone, you will find it harder to get there automatically. So if you put them in a folder somewhere, I sometimes delete them off the home screen themselves. So they're just kind of in that abyss of apps that the iPhone has when you scroll across. It means that when you go to have that automatic reach for the app, you won't be able to find it in the same place. So again, we'll build that conscious awareness of, when am I automatically just trying to seek out one of these apps? Like, when am I doing it and I'm not realizing? Now, this might need to be redone over time, depending on how used of the location you get to. So you might move them and then over time find that you're now just in an automatic relationship with the new location on the phone. So it might take some trial and error. Another thing I have used that I have found personally very helpful, and shout out to the Imperfects podcast, because I think this is where I first heard about this app from. It is called One Sec, and it is an app that will automatically take you out of the application, so like Instagram, when you click on it for around about a second or so, and it will prompt you to then think about whether you actually want to be in, say, Instagram. So I have it set on Instagram. When I click on it, it then opens up this other screen. It like loads for a second. I think it tells you to take a deep breath and then you can say, yes, I want to click in Instagram. I'm making the conscious choice to go in there, right? Or no, I actually didn't want to be on Instagram. And I found that when I was in that stage of really automatically finding and opening Instagram, that this app helped me to break that cycle a little bit. So I would realize how often I automatically clicked into Instagram a day. And then that kind of helped to reset that. So that's one method. Also, turning off or reviewing all your notifications can be really helpful. So limiting that constant stream of notifications that comes up every day, thinking about which apps are notifying you and for what, and you can go in and adjust those settings to make sure you're not getting those constant interruptions or that pull to be clicking into social media. Then there is the location of your phone. Now, this has been said time and time again, and for some people it really won't work, but I have found it helpful. It's often recommended on different resources and websites, but moving your phone away. So for me, this is having it outside of the bedroom, like when it's plugged in charging overnight, it's not in my room. And I find that my problematic or passive social media use is most often like when I wake up in the morning or before I go to bed.
Yes, the doom scroll before you go to bed.
Yes. Yep. And so when I'm going to bed, I go plug my phone in the other room. It's in there with, I've got another alarm next to my bed, but then I go into my room and the options are to sleep or read my book. Mm-hmm. And so then I'm kind of getting that quality time in, and I'm just putting up that barrier between the doom scrolling and nighttime.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work all of the time, or sometimes it's really hard. I really want to take my phone into my room, or it's uncomfortable, but I find if I push through and the more I get used to it, the more I find it very beneficial. Now, Another element of
Yep.
these strategies is thinking about the content that we're exposed to on social media. So like you mentioned, one of those impacts that we can see on mental health, so the negative impacts can be related to the type of content that we see on social media and that exposure to negative content.
Yeah, like who we're following.
Exactly. So you can unfollow or mute different accounts that you might find you're following them, but you're not really experiencing kind of joy or a positive engagement with those accounts. You might be feeling that really negative upward social comparison like you spoke about earlier, or you might just be getting exposed to content that you are not wanting to see. There are also different sections in social media apps where you can limit particular terms or types of content, and that might be helpful for some people as well if there's particular topics or things that they find really confronting as well. So reducing that physically on the apps.
And on the flip side of that, maybe following those accounts that do uplift you and bring you joy, such as, this is a bit of a shameless plug, but this might help on Instagram and TikTok.
Yes, exactly. And another element is to put some of that little external motivation or pressure in as well to help you along the journey. And so that can be telling your friends and family that you're, slowing down with your social media use, you're taking a break, you've got different goals around reducing your screen time, something like that. But telling someone, just, mentioning it to a friend, mentioning it to a family member can really put on a bit of that external pressure to help you along the way. And all of these strategies, I guess, speak to how we really want to start thinking about how and why we use social media. So like we said, and I guess the whole purpose of this episode is that we don't want to get rid of it completely. We want to harness the positives. We want to build in that active, enjoyable engagement when we're increasing social connection, but we want to decrease those negative mental health impacts. And what we see in the research around how we can make that balance happen more effectively is about becoming more consciously aware of how and why we're using social media, increase the positive time and decrease that problematic passive social media use.
Amazing. So that brings us almost to the end of episode 1. Thank you so much for listening if you've made it this far through this episode. So all the research and resources that we've spoken about in today's episode will be found in the show notes. As always, if you need further support, please get in touch with a healthcare professional, and further helplines are always provided in the show notes.
If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, help us grow, share it with a friend or a family member. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We are on socials at This Might Help Podcast as well. Engage with some active, positive social media use and limit that negative social media use.
100%.
Yeah. And the full video version of this podcast is also available on YouTube at This Might Help Podcast.
New episodes drop every Tuesday, so we'll see you next week.
Bye.